Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone in-house to be so kind to check that cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated. And, of course, the program will be posted on our website following today's presentation for everyone's future reference. Our internet viewers are reminded that questions or comments can be sent at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We are pleased to co-host this program today with the National Review Institute, and in spite of her age, I am happy to introduce Catherine Lopez, who is a senior fellow, how that can be, at the National Review Institute. Please join in welcoming Catherine. Catherine?
Thank you so much. Hair dye does a lot, by the way. Thank you so much for being here. Obviously, this is a topic that hits close to home for all of us at some point in one way or another, and is a particularly contentious and heartbreaking and heart-wrenching debate that's going on right now with legislation that seems to want to be steamrolling across the country without an actual debate about it. So we're trying to help by being here today, actually have a conversation about this and consider what pressures are on people, what needs people have. We have here today Sister Constance Veet, who's the Director of Communications for the Little Sisters of the Poor. Far Curlin, who's a doctor, who is at Duke University School of Medicine. Ryan Anderson, who is the William E. Simon Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation, who just wrote a paper. If you haven't read it, I commend it to you on these issues, talking about really caring for people. And we're going to start first, though. I believe we're ready to run a video that features Maggie Carner, who has served as the director of the Life and Health Ministries for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and she's suffering from the same brain cancer that Brittany Maynard was suffering from before she took her life. And so we thought that was an appropriate way to start this panel.
It's scary, and it knocks the breath out of you. It takes a long time to come to terms with a disease, especially a terminal illness. And then you start thinking, okay, this is a new me, this is the new normal, and I can still appreciate every moment. I'm Maggie Carner, and I'm 51. I live in Bristol, Connecticut. I'm married to a wonderful spouse, and I have 3 beautiful daughters. I was diagnosed last April, about almost a year ago, with aggressive brain cancer. It's called glioblastoma. The first round of treatment was chemo and radiation, and I did really good for a while, and then now the cancer cells have come back, and the tumor is starting to grow again. Here on the mantle I have kind of my little collection of family pictures. This is my mom on her wedding day, and this is my dad, my hero dad. My dad was always very active, and toward the end of his life he had a spinal cord accident which made him a quadriplegic. That was a really rough transition for him, and all of us were just heartbroken to think of how is Dad going to exist without the use of his arms and legs. Initially, our attention to him and our willingness to be with him all the time, I think, was hard for him because there was nothing he could do in return. But I think he settled into it very gracefully, and he realized the value of the words that were being spoken, and we learned a lot. It was a gift that my dad gave to us because he spent that time with us. I saw with my own 2 eyes what joy can still be found in just valuing every moment. It doesn't mean it's going to be great, doesn't mean it's going to be romantic, but there are moments that are valuable, that need to be cherished. And here I am years later after my father's death, and my siblings and I still talk about those moments. He left us a legacy of that time that he gave us. He could have checked out right away and said, I'm done with this. But he didn't. He stuck around and he said, I'm here for you. And so my dad showed me not just how to live and how to do stuff and how to be productive. He showed me how to die with grace and dignity.
I think that's a particularly powerful video, obviously, because this is not a policy analyst or a commentator talking, obviously. But also, and thanks to Deirdre McQuaid and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops for getting us that video, and similar testimonies they're working on. Obviously, Brittany Maynard's case is so compelling because she's living it, right? But one of the issues that concerns a lot of us the most, of course, is that anyone would feel like they were useless because they didn't have use of their arms or legs, or because they would be slowly deteriorating. And what are we saying to people when we're saying that they're not useful anymore and their lives somehow has less value? Let's start with Ryan, who has just written this paper for the Heritage Foundation. I'd like each of our panelists to sort of talk about, from their perspective, why this is so important to be talking about right now in sober and humane terms, and what concerns you the most.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for coming. This is really one of the first times that the Heritage Foundation has weighed into this particular area of public policy. And so the paper that we published last week is a little long. It's 22 pages when printed as a PDF. But we tried to be comprehensive, and we tried to highlight some of the policy concerns, some of the legal concerns if we allow physicians to assist their patients in committing suicide. And so I want to highlight 4 areas that the Heritage paper discusses, and then turn it over to Dr. Curlin, who's going to speak about this specifically from the perspective of a physician, and then to Sister Constance, someone who takes care of the elderly and the sick towards the end of life, for that kind of first-person perspective. I think our top-line concern as a policy institute is that physician-assisted suicide sends the message that some lives are unworthy of life. It fundamentally denies human equality before the law, human dignity before the law, and it says that some lives are unworthy of the legal protections that we extend to all other lives. So we highlight in the paper 4 areas where there are problems. The subtitle of the paper is How Physician-Assisted Suicide Endangers the Weak, Corrupts Medicine, Compromises the Family, and Violates Human Dignity and Equality. And the reason why we've entered into this particular policy debate right now is that there are 18 states, plus the District of Columbia, that this year alone are considering whether or not to allow physician-assisted suicide. Allowing physician-assisted suicide violates the Hippocratic Oath, a principle that has served the practice of medicine well for 2.5 millennia. The idea that a physician should not assist a patient in killing themselves or directly kill a patient. With physician-assisted suicide, a physician prescribes a lethal medication, and then the patient is supposed to ingest it him or herself. What we've seen from other jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, is that physician-assisted suicide leads to voluntary euthanasia, which in turn leads to involuntary euthanasia, because it's based on the judgment that certain lives are unworthy of life. So why would it only be someone who is capable of ingesting the lethal medication him or herself? It then leads to the doctor in voluntary euthanasia directly injecting the lethal drug, and then to involuntary euthanasia, where a patient can't even request this, doesn't request this. So in the paper, we highlight some of the stories, the reports actually, from the Netherlands and from Belgium, in which physician-assisted suicide led to voluntary euthanasia and then led to involuntary euthanasia. And we highlight just some of the statistics on how many patients each year are killed without even ever requesting to be euthanized. We now see this happening with children, both in the Netherlands and in Belgium. We just highlight some of these from government reports themselves. These are statistics coming out of these governments. But in general, what we highlight is that those who would be most likely tempted into physician-assisted suicide are those who are at the margins of society. The weak, the elderly, the disabled, those without strong support systems. We saw here in the United States that after Oregon allowed physician-assisted suicides, healthcare plans in the state sent letters to cancer patients saying, we can't afford to cover your cancer treatment, but we can cover your assisted suicide. Those most likely to be endangered by physician-assisted suicide are going to be those who are struggling with depression or with loneliness or with other psychiatric illnesses. We cite some researchers, medical school professors who focus on mental health, looking at, they report that 95% of people who commit suicide were suffering with a diagnosable mental disease in the year preceding their suicide. And yet in Oregon, we know that in the past 2 years, only 5 patients out of the 178 patients who were assisted in suicide were referred for psychiatric evaluation. And that in the entirety of since physician-assisted suicide in Oregon has been allowed, it's 5% of patients who have been referred for psychiatric evaluation, and yet we know that 95% of patients who do commit suicide are suffering from these mental diseases. So it's not doing enough to protect the patient that would be contemplating this. I also then analyzed the DC law. In particular, the DC law is modeled on Oregon's law, and it's a model for the other 18 states. Looked at the purported safeguards that the bill provides, and they're woefully inadequate, even if autonomy is the only value that you think is to be protected here. The type of safeguards that they provide is that you have to make 2 oral requests for physician-assisted suicide and 1 written request. The 2 verbal requests have to be separated by 15 days, and then the written request has to be somewhere in between. It has to be witnessed by 2 witnesses, one of whom can be a family member or someone who stands to benefit from your death. And they both verify that you are not suffering from depression and that you're mentally competent. You need 2 people to verify that on your written request, one of whom can stand to benefit from your death, and the other one of whom can be one of their friends. Then it requires a physician to say that you have a disease that would render you dead in 6 months, and a second physician to second that judgment. But the physician can be any one of your choosing. And we know that Compassion and Choices and some of the other advocacy groups for physician-assisted suicide keep a list of friendly, compliant doctors. So it's not going to be your family physician. It's not going to be an impartial, neutral physician. The strongest member of your household can take you to see one of the compliant physicians who will attest that you are eligible for this and acting in a sound, healthy state of mind. That family member can then act as one of the witnesses for this, and 2 weeks later you can be handed a lethal drug, which you then consume in the privacy of your own home, in which whoever is the strongest, most powerful member of that household will control the circumstances under which that drug will or will not be consumed. There are absolutely no safeguards at the moment at which the lethal drugs will be ingested. This leads us simply to conclude that if you're simply concerned about autonomy, this bill does not do enough to protect autonomy. But then briefly, I want to turn to the other 3 issues, and then I want to allow the other panelists to highlight these, because these really touch on some of their areas of expertise. This will corrupt the practice of medicine. More or less every major medical professional association, including the American Medical Association, professional associations of doctors, of nurses, of hospice care physicians, are opposed to physician-assisted suicide. They see it as fundamentally incompatible with the vocation of a doctor, which is to be a healer. That killing is incompatible with healing. And that allowing doctors to assist in the killing of their patients will corrupt the doctor-patient relationship, whether or not patients can entirely trust that their physician has their best interests at heart, whether they can be open with their physicians about their struggles, whether it's with mental illness or depression or loneliness, whether their physician will then interpret that as a cry not for help, but as a cry for assisted suicide. It fundamentally changes the outlook of a physician whose heart should be set on everything within the realm of reason that they can do to aid their patient in living life, in healing disease, in treating symptoms of pain, and of dying a natural death with dignity. One of the things that we point out is that you need not utilize every medical means under the sun. Saying that we're opposed to physician-assisted suicide does not mean that we think life should be extended artificially at all costs. At a certain point, medical treatment is futile. Another round of chemo or radiation is simply unnecessary, it's imprudent. At that point, the alternative is not physician-assisted suicide, but it's hospice care, it's palliative care, it's human fellowship and presence. And we'll hear more about that from the other two panelists. The third thing I mentioned is that this really compromises the family and intergenerational commitments. If you're familiar with my research at Heritage, a lot of it up until now had focused on marriage and the importance of parents to their children. The flip side of that social contract is at the end of life, adult children and their obligations to their elderly parents. And one of the things that physician-assisted suicide sends is the message that maybe our grandparents are burdens that need to be disposed of rather than people who need to be loved and cared for. It also opens up the possibility that the elderly, the sick, the disabled will view themselves as burdens. So the law sends that message not just to middle-aged children who are now viewing their dependent parents or grandparents as burdens, but the parents and grandparents themselves. Which then leads to the final thing I'll mention, which is the equality before the law. Many of the disability rights groups are opposed to this law because this law sends a signal that their lives are worth fewer legal protections than the lives of the able-bodied. If you're an able-bodied person and you are experiencing suicidal thoughts, the law will prevent you from committing suicide. It will get you adequate psychiatric care. But if you are disabled and you're experiencing suicidal thought, legalizing physician-assisted suicide will actually allow a physician not to help you, but to assist you in killing. So the disability rights group Not Dead Yet has pointed out that this treats their lives as unworthy of the equal protection of law that everyone else would receive. And so it radically compromises one of our nation's founding principles, which is to treat all lives as invaluable as all lives as worthy of the law's protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Dr. Kerlin?
Thank you. As Ryan indicated, the Hippocratic Oath, this ancient oath from 3rd or 4th century BC Greece, contains centrally this commitment that I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody if asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. The question that arises is, well, why is that there? Why is that something that physicians have with a tremendous consistency over 2,000 plus years continued to affirm and profess? Why should that not be treated as some kind of old superstition, some anachronistic commitment that we can discard in our era? And I'm going to give you 3 reasons from my own practice of medicine. These reasons are all connected, and they all, I think, display why a commitment to never participate in assisted suicide is essential for the possibility of doctors continuing to care well for patients who are dying. The first is that the commitment to not kill our patients or help them kill themselves is an essential guard against the temptation to get rid of patient suffering by getting rid of the patient who suffers. I can tell you from experience, and if you've had loved ones who have died from disabling, crippling, difficult diseases, you can attest to this. Watching people suffer is hard. It stirs up in us discomfort. More than just for the patient themselves, it's difficult for those around them. Not just the pain, which thankfully we have many effective treatments for, but the debility, the dependence, the fatigue, the sadness, the loss is hard to watch. And there arises and has arisen, I'm sure, for all of human history, the temptation when you're observing suffering to get rid of the suffering in any means possible, including by getting rid of the one who suffers. Simplest way to do it, that's the simplest way to get rid of the suffering. And for these millennia, physicians have made a solemn commitment to not kill their patients as a hedge against this very natural temptation. You might say that this is a temptation that is constitutive in the practice of medicine. If you're going to care for people who are sick and dying, you're going to experience this temptation. So that's the first. The second reason is that the commitment to not kill one's patients gives physicians the freedom they need to aggressively and effectively treat the difficult symptoms that accompany terminal illnesses. I practice palliative medicine. I practice it primarily in the context of hospice. My patients suffer pain, breathlessness, constipation, nausea, fatigue. Thankfully, we have many effective treatments for these symptoms, but our treatments, our most effective treatments, many of them have significant side effects. And among those side effects, central is the fact that they reduce the level of consciousness of patients. They make it hard for patients to communicate, hard to walk and talk, and do the things that we experience in human life as really central to our human experience. Importantly, sometimes relieving difficult and refractory pain or other symptoms means accepting that as a side effect, an unintended side effect, the patient's life will be shorter than it would be otherwise, that death will come sooner than it would be otherwise. And I'll give you an example. Suppose a patient comes to me, I've seen many such patients, with end-stage chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, emphysema, let's say, and they're feeling breathless all the time. And it's clear from all of the medical course that this is going to lead to their death soon and for certain. And they're struggling and they're out of breath. The best medication for that is narcotics, morphine. And if I'm standing there in front of them, committing to them that I'm going to care for you in this, the question naturally arises, knowing that morphine can, as a side effect, to some extent suppress their drive to breathe as it alleviates their breathlessness. What are you aiming for here, doctor? And what's essential for me to be able to effectively care for them is to be able to answer them as I do. And the question comes up. This is not abstract. It comes up over and over in patients and their families. Are you killing them? In so many words. For me to be able to say, I will not, I am your physician. As your physician, I will not intentionally hasten your or your loved one's death. I'm going to treat their symptoms in such a way as to achieve relief of those symptoms, accepting the side effects potentially of their life not being as long as it would be otherwise, but I will not aim at their death. So that boundary gives the freedom to actually treat effectively. The third reason, and it's again related, is that the commitment to not kill one's patients or make any suggestion to that effect makes it possible for patients to trust their physicians. This question of trust is paramount. It's always been paramount for physicians. It's almost certainly why this commitment came up in the Hippocratic renewal movement and reform movement of medicine. People in our plural culture, which let's be honest, includes a lot of disagreement about a lot of things, have supported the profession of medicine in no small part because there's agreement across all these moral communities that preserving and restoring patients' health is a good thing. Doesn't matter whether you're black or white, rich or poor, conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican, it's a good thing. Not true for intentionally hastening the death of your patient. And I'll say it's really important that it's particularly not true, if you pay attention to the research on this, it's not true among the poor. We don't find the cry for physician-assisted suicide coming out of historically marginalized communities. It's not coming from the Association of Black Clergy. It's not coming from the Latino community. It's not coming from immigrant communities. It's not coming from the poor. It's not coming from the disabled. It's not even coming from the elderly, primarily. This is a cry for more choice that primarily arises from the community of those who already have the most choice. And these other communities, I will tell you from experience working in the south side of Chicago and now in Durham, North Carolina, many people go without effective palliative medicine at the end of their lives because they're worried that their physicians have kind of let themselves loose from these historical boundaries and are now more or less trying to find a way to ease them into being dead. Just make it smooth, make it quiet, make it go quickly, not too much hubbub. That's a suspicion and a concern many people have. The commitment from physicians to never intentionally hasten their patient's death is therefore fundamental to the practice of medicine. You can't, so I think there's a false notion that what we're after here is compassionate care versus a kind of moralizing, detached sanctity, personal sanctity of physicians. It's not true. We're either going to have effective palliative medicine for patients and good care, or we're going to have maximal choice, including helping patients die, but we're not going to have both.
Thank you, Dr. Carlin. Sister Constance?
Thank you for having us today. I'd like to just begin by thanking Ryan. I read his paper, and I was very struck because, in the news coverage about this issue presently, at least, we're kind of focused on several young women. And Ryan makes it very clear in his paper that this is an issue that is predominantly, I would say, going to affect the elderly, and that's the population that I serve. I'm a Little Sister of the Poor. We're an international community of Catholic women religious who care for the needy elderly in over 30 countries around the world. We've been here in the United States since 1868, in Washington since 1871. And the only thing that we do around the world is to care for the elderly. So it's really, it's what our whole lives are devoted to. And in doing that, we seek to offer them a home where they will be welcomed as Christ, cared for as family, and accompanied with dignity and compassion until God calls them to himself. And so I'd like to just describe to you a little bit of our practice in caring for the dying, and then recount a couple of recent scenarios that I was involved in that can help to illustrate what our lives and our convictions are about. We have, all of our homes have multiple levels of care. So we're not solely caring for the dying, but we are caring for those reaching the end of life's journey. The average age of admission of our residents, at least here in the United States, would be in the 80s. And so I think we're dealing with a very different scenario from someone as young as Brittany Maynard. Generally the people that we're caring for and who are reaching the dying stage are in their 80s and 90s, which makes things very different. And I think I can say that for the most part, death is looked upon in our homes not with fear or dread, but with hope-filled expectation by our residents. These are people who, for the most part, have lived lives of faith, who, in many cases, their closest loved ones have already gone on before them. And so they look upon death in a different way. They look upon it as the climax of their lives, the logical conclusion of their lives, a time when they will be reunited with their loved ones who have gone before them, and a time when they will finally meet the God face to face whom they have sought and served their whole lives. And that gives an entirely different perspective, I think, to the dying process. As Little Sisters of the Poor, from the very beginning of our congregation in 1839, it's always been part of our tradition that we keep a constant watch, a constant vigil ourselves with those who have entered the dying process. Today, we have many paid staff members, professional and paraprofessional staff members. But we as Little Sisters ourselves take turns to stay at the bedside of a resident who is recognized to have entered the dying process. So that means 24/7. And still, we involve our staff, volunteers, we have a lay association. Many people are involved in that care of the dying person. But I would say that the room of a dying person almost becomes the spiritual center of our house at that point for those days. Definitely, it's a spiritually and humanly very intense time in our homes because all the best is done for that person. From bringing out the best bed linens that we kind of save for when someone is dying so that, things look as beautiful as possible, to what they're wearing, to trying to have flowers, soft music, etc. Those kind of human touches that make a difference in the environment of the person. family members are invited to stay at the bedside of the dying resident 24/7 if they wish to, and to assist us in the care of the residents. I asked a few sisters in preparing for this if they had any direct experience with family members asking us to hasten the death of their loved ones. And I have to say, here in the United States, we have not really faced that yet. I think there are a few isolated cases out there of maybe something suspicious happening, but it's not something that we experience often as Little Sisters here in the United States. I think in Europe it's more common, certainly in Belgium where euthanasia is legal. I think our Little Sisters would answer that issue differently. But here in the United States, it's really not something that we have to face on a daily basis yet. You know, our residents, our home is their home, and they look upon their rooms as their home. In most cases, they prefer not to be hospitalized unless it's absolutely necessary. And many of our residents die of cardiac-related conditions, congestive heart failure, things that are chronic and for which they've been hospitalized. And they commonly reach a point where they and their families say, no more hospitalization. You know, the next time I have this crisis of congestive heart failure, or the next time I have a TIA, or the next time I don't want to go to the hospital anymore, I want to stay home. And that's exactly how they express it. And so we are able to surround them with a peaceful peripheral presence for as long as it takes until they make that passage from this life to the next. I think the most maybe dramatic case was we had a woman dying a couple of years ago in the home I was in, and she was the mother of, I think she had 8 children of her own, but she had also been a foster parent, and so there were many people at her bedside. This family kept constant vigil for 8, as well as us Little Sisters, for 8 full days, because this little lady was just going on, and they brought sleeping bags. We offered them a guest room, so some of them would take shifts and sleep. Some of them were sleeping in sleeping bags on the floor with Grandma because they wanted to be there. And it was such an intense family time. She was no longer verbal or visibly conscious. But what happened in that room with her family was absolutely beautiful, because there were family reconciliations. There were certain level of spiritual reconciliation with the church for a couple of her sons, and so much reminiscing going on, and so much learning from Grandma, even though she was silent in the bed, that it was just a beautiful experience. And it went on for 8 days, and they stuck it out for the entire time. It was really beautiful. So that's, to give you a general idea. A couple of specific instances besides that woman. Last fall, we had a gentleman who was declining, and we wear pagers in the home. And so if something happens, they'll call the sisters and they'll ask us all to go to a certain resident's room. So this one morning, we got the page to go to this gentleman's room. He was an African-American gentleman, and I think he might have been single. I know he had nieces, but he didn't have any children. So there was none of his actual family there at the moment. They had been called and they were on the way, but he was obviously, getting to his last moments. So when I walked in, there was a number of staff persons there, nurses and nursing assistants, and our staff at our house in Washington many of them are African. And one by one, they were surrounding his bed, and one by one, they were singing various hymns from their own faith traditions. He was non-Catholic. Some of them were Catholic, some of them weren't. Some of them were singing in English, some of them were singing in various African languages. But this is how the next hour, 2 hours, transpired while this man was in his final moments. His niece arrived toward the very end. But I thought it was absolutely beautiful, because the staff arrived on the scene, so to speak, before the sisters did, because they were, the workers in the section of the house where he lived. And just spontaneously, they just started this singing and praying with him. And that's how it went until he died. And, I was really touched, because I said, well, our staff, they know what to do. They know how we do it. And they were already praying and singing with him before we even arrived. So that was just a beautiful passage. It was a very peaceful. Very often we say that our old people just go out like a candle because, they just go out very gradually and sometimes imperceptibly, and you really have to, when actually was the last breath type of thing. Because in general, the very elderly, very frail people are not going to be experiencing the intense levels of pain and discomfort of maybe younger cancer patients, we find. Another instance was this past January, we were really hit with the flu badly in Washington, and we had several deaths, and one was a 96-year-old man who has this beautiful family. His son is a deacon in the Archdiocese of Washington, and he had been hospitalized because he was in acute respiratory distress related to his cold and flu symptoms. And then he was a little bit better. He came back to the home, and he was okay for several hours, but then he kind of went into this crisis situation again. And his family decided, he's not, we don't want him to go back to the hospital, because the elderly become very disoriented in the hospital. They're not usually, often receive the level of attention that they really need. It's a very traumatic experience for them being in the hospital. So the family said, no, let's keep him here. He was surrounded by his family into the night, and he passed away that night. And he was somebody who had a certain level of dementia, but he was a real gentleman and a real character at the same time. And he would sing to the staff. He was full of jokes all the time. And you could really see very concretely how much he was missed by the staff. And a couple of days after he died, but before his funeral took place, there was a specific song he used to sing every morning to various staff members. You must have been a beautiful baby. I don't know if any of you know it, but just spontaneously in the dining room, everyone started singing that song because we were like, he's not here. Somebody has to sing the song. And then his son, the deacon, gave the homily at his funeral, and someone several months back on his 96th birthday had taped him singing that, and that's how his son ended the homily, was by playing the song. And you could just tell, even though he was old, feeble, confused, his presence was so much appreciated, and he was really missed. Then a couple of days later, we lost a woman who, coincidentally, they had been table mates in the dining room, a woman who had been suffering from Alzheimer's disease for 15 years, who hadn't spoken in years. And she also passed away from basically the same flu. And at her funeral, the priest posed the question in his homily, he said, I used to think, why is she still here? He was a friend of the family. He came to visit often. He said, why is she still here? And he answered his own question right away. He said, she was here for so long in order to bring out love in us. It was more about us, about the community surrounding her, than it was about her at that point, because she brought out the best in us as caregivers. And that is really a reality that we live. And I would just like to close my remarks with, providentially, a couple days ago, I received a reflection written by one of our youngest little sisters. She's out in California. I do our magazine, so she was sending this in to go into the next magazine, and she was reflecting on taking care of an elderly woman who's has advanced dementia, and this is what she said, and I think it's very pertinent to our discussion. She said, what is it that definitively gives life value and meaning? The answer is love. In society today, we tend to place a great deal of emphasis on what people do rather than who they are. This is why many people have lost sight of the value of the unborn baby and the elderly grandmother. Well, now may be the time to wake up the world. Looking from a fresh perspective, we can see the dependency of the tiny unborn baby and the infirm grandmother as an opportunity for greater love. You see, Rose is unable to care for herself, and this is certainly a great suffering for her. However, when I care for her, she elicits love out of my very being. In her dependency, she leads others to love without conditions. Rose is unable to say thank you or to return a favor, but she has the power to draw love out of others. There is certainly a great power in dependency. This realization gives me the conviction that she is precious in God's eyes because he created her out of love and for love. So thank you.
Thank you, sister. I just want to go through the panel and get everyone's thoughts, starting with Ryan. I was struck by what Sister was talking about how it's often more about the caregivers that they have such a beautiful experience in seeing people to their last days. What I find is, as a writer, talking about these issues, and I know Ryan experiences this on all the issues he writes about, it sounds foreign to people when you start talking about beauty and suffering and who are you to say, and it almost is like we're speaking a different language. When you have People magazine every couple of weeks now highlighting a story of some beautiful young woman who's suffering and wants to choose to end her life, there's a disconnect here. How do you bridge that? How do we do that in really practical terms, both in conversation and in policy?
Great question. I think part of that answer is, why we showed that video at the very beginning of this panel. People want to know, what's the alternative? If what Brittany Maynard did raises concerns, do you really just want me to suffer until I die? Or is there a more humane, a more human, a more compassionate way of accompanying people on the journey towards death? And I think the video, hearing from Dr. Curlin, hearing from Sister Constance, is partly to put flesh and bones onto some of the statistics and some of the policy concerns that the Heritage Report raises. It's important to know the facts and figures coming out of the Netherlands and out of Belgium. It's important to know the testimony from the disability rights community. It's important to know what the medical ethicists are saying. I think it's also even more important to know the stories directly from the physicians, from the caregivers, from the patients themselves. One of the stories that we highlight in the Heritage Report is from Victoria Kennedy, the widow of Senator Ted Kennedy. And she goes through, she was the leading spokesperson against the Massachusetts physician-assisted suicide law, which they successfully defeated.
It would have passed if it were not
For her.
Yeah.
And she said that this bill stands against everything that my late husband stood for. That Ted Kennedy wanted quality health care for all Americans, including the weak, the marginalized, the disabled, the minorities, and that this bill would make those communities most likely to be at risk. It stands exactly against. And then she just told the story of Senator Kennedy's passing. He was told he had 6 months to live. He ended up living for 15 months. There were struggles, there was suffering, but there's also a lot of joy, a lot of laughter, a lot of singing. She goes through this and she says, this is what a death with dignity actually looks like. Prescribing 100 pills and then leaving an elderly person on their own to take these pills or to be pressured by a family member to take these pills is the exact opposite of a death with dignity. And so partly it's telling those stories to counteract the People magazine stories, and partly just educating people. They were successful in Massachusetts in preventing this because they informed people about the reality of this. The Hollywood glamorized People magazine version doesn't tell the whole truth.
Dr. Carlin?
Well, I agree entirely. One thing I think it's particularly sobering about Brittany Maynard is the way her story and the way her story was put forward in the media seems to reify or to demonstrate how much our culture has come to value, in this case, a young woman for being in control, being beautiful, having all of her capacities at peak form. And she didn't have an imagination to see her life and herself as having worth when those were diminished or taken away.
And that flows from our cultural moment, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not to blame her. It's just it should be a symptom or a sign that causes us to think, how do we get to that point that a young woman would think of her existence and her life in those terms. The choice of physician-assisted suicide changes other choices. It introduces new questions It just does logically. So when physician-assisted suicide or assisted suicide gains the patina of respectability and professionalism by having physicians engaged in it and by it being legal, then it forces the question for the elderly patient, for the next young woman who's got a brain cancer of why are you staying alive? I mean, if you have a legitimate, societally affirmed option of taking your own life, that forces the question, why are you not making that choice? And inevitably, if you look back through history, when such a choice is put socially, it's going to be those whose lives are least useful in the instrumental, economic, power-driven world that are going to feel the most pressure to go ahead and exit the scene. And that's antithetical to a public polity that is committed to the rights of every individual, and it's antithetical to the culture that must animate medicine if patients are going to be able to entrust themselves to us when they're weakest and most vulnerable.
And also from a medical point of view, and also a choice point of view, we're living in a time where the pain, as you talked about, can be relieved in ways that never before. Why would we be leaning toward death when there are so many options?
It's very telling that the people who opt for physician-assisted suicide, at least the ones that have been accounted for in Oregon, for example, if you look at their individual cases, it's not cases of uncontrolled pain. The people are choosing because they experience dependency, the threat of looming death, and not being able to make the choices and exercise the options they used to make as something that they do not want to bear anymore. So it's this picture of the person who's in agonizing pain and writhing in breathlessness, and it can't be relieved. Therefore, compassion requires us to intentionally help them kill themselves. Is just a false image. It's not real.
Sister Constance?
Yeah, I can say honestly that I have never myself witnessed nor even heard about, I'm a little sister for 27 years. I have never heard about any of our residents asking us to end their lives. And I think that's because they are surrounded with a caring human and spiritual presence in our homes. And they see that, they see other residents pass on, and they gain a certain comfort level, let's say, in knowing that when their turn comes, they'll be treated the same way. So it's just an entirely different scenario than the Brittany Maynard and other people like her. I think that it's really providential, I think, because at the same time that Brittany Maynard became such a big story in the news, there was another story, which is still continuing, and there are actually 3 stories that I'm aware of. There may be more, but at the same time that Brittany Maynard came to life, the young woman in Cincinnati, Lauren Hill, came into the limelight, and she's still going. She's still, she has a very similar diagnosis to Brittany Maynard, but she's still out there trying to raise money for cancer research. There's also the figure of Kara Tibbetts, who just passed away, who also, she had breast cancer that metastasized. And then there's, her name escapes me, Maggie Carner, right? Who's another spokesperson. So, really you have the one Brittany Maynard, and in the same time frame, we have 3 other women who, very similar scenarios, young, attractive people who are speaking a different message. And I think, is it the media machine behind the one? I think there's more than enough to counter her story with these other stories if we take it upon ourselves to get those stories out there to show that there is another way to look at this. And, I listened just in the last couple of days, Brittany Maynard's final testimony came out on video, and the terms that she used to talk about her experience were terms that I have never heard in my experience applied to the dying process. For instance, she talked about purposeless, prolonged pain. She talked about prolonged involuntary suffering and shame. I have never heard any of our residents use the word shame in the context of their suffering and dying. So I just can't really imagine where she was coming from, but there's very contrasting messages from these other women that we just need to get out there more. And also I think for us, the families communicate powerful messages, and maybe we need to call more upon families who have experienced the death with dignity in the natural, God-intended way. For us little sisters, the families of our deceased residents become the most powerful spokespeople for us. And just as an organization, but also, if we ask them to share what they've learned through the experience, there is so much to be learned, shared, and gained in these intense moments that you cheat people out of when a life is ended prematurely. That I think could help also turn. And I think that's what Jackie Kennedy does effectively. I read the comments that you put in your paper from her. She communicates that very effectively.
Well, we have a few minutes, so I wanted to open this to questions.
One is, Arena Grosso with Family Research Council. I have two questions. One of them is, I think one of a very powerful way to bring the ugliness of assisted suicide into the mainstream is to really discuss what happens when someone does take barbiturate and doesn't die. And in a lot of cases, they have to be suffocated, or physically someone actually kills them because when it's not powerful enough, and it takes longer, then it's not a very quick process. No one talks about the ugliness of that process of even taking this, because it's not just, it doesn't happen instantly. So maybe I think that's one powerful way. The second is to talk about, I think in America, because we focus so much on autonomy, and CNC has been very successful in pushing for, well, this is your choice, and it's kind of like a natural process from you have a choice at the beginning of life and you have a choice at the end of life, is to show that really, that as Ryan pointed out, that there isn't really that much autonomy, and that there is a slippery slope and you do lose your autonomy. But how do you teach medical students who are now being taught that autonomy is the #1 rule in medicine, and not what they would say, quote unquote, moralism, to do what's in the best interest of the patient, but instead to have them make the decision on their behalf? If you can talk about that, and also if you know of things that have been published that talk about the ugliness of the assisted suicide process.
I actually disagree with you. That I don't think the ugliness is where we should focus, because humans can come up with very efficient and apparently smooth ways to kill others or kill ourselves, and technology is very simple for a smooth, motionless death. Now, it may be that there are cases in which people take overdoses or take lethal doses of barbiturates and they don't die as they expected, but I don't think that's where we want to focus, because then the answer is let's just give them potassium chloride and make it even smoother. I do agree with you that a problem is that culturally we've come to have an imagination in which autonomy is construed as people having as many choices available to them as possible, has come to be seen as the only norm that we can all agree about, and has come to be seen as kind of the dominant ethical principle of medicine. It can be seen, and I certainly in my domain try to help students see that becomes sort of self-contradictory and senseless. And one way to show that is just to ask, well, what is medicine for? What is medicine for? And if medicine is for something other than just giving people the maximal number of choices to use with whatever technologies are available to them, then there are going to be some choices that are not consistent with what medicine is for. This is one of those choices. If medicine is for preserving and restoring patients' health, if we're asking physicians to commit themselves and discipline themselves to a set of practices that make it possible for patients to entrust themselves to them when they're sick and when they're disabled and when they're weak and frail and in pain, then we have to avoid engaging in those practices that undermine that possibility or contradict it directly. Killing our patients is, or helping them kill themselves is one of those practices.
Let me just add one thing to that. On page 19 of the report, so it's understandable if you didn't make it that far, but I quote Dr. Leon Cass about autonomy, simply the etymology of it. Autonomy means self-legislating, autonomos, self-law, self-legislating. And he says that autonomy is really highlighted in the philosophy of Kant. And the whole idea here is it would be self-directed action in accordance with the moral law. And that now autonomy is being redefined as simply doing whatever you want to do. That autonomy for Kant meant self-directed action that's morally upright, not do as you please. And that the American founders made this same distinction. It was the distinction that they had between liberty and license. And I think Farr is exactly right in saying that the cultural problem in the United States, our moral imagination, is that we've elevated autonomy as the only value, and we've defined it incorrectly as simply doing as what you want, rather than self-will in accordance with moral law.
Hi, my name is Melissa Ortiz, and I am an independent consultant in the conservative movement. I also have a very small organization called Able Americans that approaches the issues that people with chronic illness and disability face from a life-affirming perspective. And I just want to say, as someone who has lived with a lifelong disability, my life rocks. And the person that comes to me and tells me that I have no value simply because I'm not walking around, they're going to get a really stern argument from me and the people of the army of people who adore me simply because I draw breath, and who I adore in return simply because they put up with me. And my point in saying all this is that one of the ways that the CNC people sold their argument and people bought it is they changed the terminology that they used, and they made it pretty. And we as conservatives have got to steal a page from their playbook. Instead of talking about the elderly and the disabled, we have to talk about people who are elderly, people with disabilities. Because when you start talking about people, it gives value, because we are all valuable in some respect. And I loved what you had to say about the Little Sisters of the Poor. And I think I missed my calling because I got married before I heard about the Little Sisters of the Poor. And I think I can do this without crying. I lost a grandmother that I was particularly close to, the grandmother who taught me to read when I was 3, when it was determined that I would not be able to run outside with other children. And I sang her home. And she looked at me and she said, "The choir has tuned up and you need to sing with me as I go." And it was precious. And I defy anybody who says that death is not a thing of beauty, because it is as God ordained it to be. And I would go one step further and say that I would love to know your opinion of this, that we as a society have decided that suffering is a problem. Because suffering isn't just about me. There are days that I'm in pretty ungodly pain. Don't take a lot of pain medication because I don't like how loose-lipped it makes me, even worse than I am at the moment. And we forget that suffering is not just about us personally. The days that I don't feel good, that suffering's not just about me. It's about the people around me and how I handle it and the example that I give. And I would love to hear the 3 of you, the 4 of you, respond to the idea that we as a culture have decided that suffering is beneath us.
Can I start with that one? Well, in reference to your grandmother, we have, I would say the majority of the family members involved with the residents who pass away in our homes experience it as a moment of grace and a thing of beauty. And it's pretty rare that when the whole process is done, and we generally have the funerals in our home, and, it's rare that they feel it was anything other than a very powerful spiritual and human moment. I think that you know, when Brittany Maynard talked about purposeless, prolonged pain and suffering, I guess I would say to her, there is no suffering that's purposeless. You know, it's a matter of discerning the purpose in it. And Kara Tibbetts said something, I think you quoted this in an article that just appeared this morning too, Catherine.
National Review Online.
Yeah, the woman who just passed away after having written a book about her suffering. She was the mother of 4 children, and she had written an open letter to Brittany Maynard in which she said, "Suffering is not the absence of goodness, it is not the absence of beauty, but perhaps it can be the place where true beauty can be known." And we certainly see that. And also, I'd like to quote Pope John Paul II, who said that suffering exists in the world in order to unleash love and the gift of self in the others, in us, in those who surround the suffering person. And that's where the beauty comes in, when you see the absolutely extraordinary things that can happen in families and in caregivers who are surrounding the person. So yeah, definitely.
Just very briefly, there's been a whole body of research in which people are asked to imagine a state in which they have one disability or another, and they're to rate their quality of life. What would your quality of life be if you were confined to a wheelchair or a power chair? Or what would be your quality of life if you were blind, if you couldn't talk, and so on? And what's clear from the data is that people imagine a much lower quality of life than the people who have those disabilities indicate when they're asked about their quality of life. In which case, in virtually all disabilities, the people's judgments about their happiness, their quality of life, their worth are equal to the general population. One other thing that I think comes out of the tradition of medicine that we hope to hold on to, but it slips with things like physician-assisted suicide, is that when people have suffered devastating injuries, say someone falls out of a tree stand and breaks his neck, or has an automobile accident and breaks her back, very commonly doctors observe that in the time around that injury, people asked to die. Let me go, stop the treatment, I don't want this. They've had severe burns, same thing. And it's been the practice in most places, rehab places and so on, of just ignoring that. I mean, with respectful, engaged communication, saying, we're not going to do that, give us 6 months, and we'll have this conversation again. And what we find is that people learn, and they realize, you know, my life's not over. My life's not over, and very few continue with that kind of a request if they're cared for well in the interim.
I don't know if I have anything to add. I think the 3 of you have covered this quite well. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for closing this perfectly. And thank you, we've kept you a little longer than we should have, so thank you very much for being here today. And thank you so much to our panelists. And Ryan does have shorter versions of his paper he's written.